we have Sandra and Luke from You+Pea from the UK, who are going to be talking a little bit about video game urbanism. Just for me to introduce them a little bit, are they on the... Okay, they're here. Okay. You+Pea is the architectural design studio of Sandra, Youkhana, and Luke, Casper, Pearson. Their work explores the integration of video game technologies into architectural design, leading conversations on how games can engage new participants in the design of cities. They work with cultural and educational institutions, industry partners, developers, and city planners to bridge the gap between multiple disciplines and provoke new conversations about the future of architectural design through the use of games. Sandra and Luke established and led the Videogame Urbanism studio at Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, where they use game technologies to realize urban design research. Hi, so great to have you here. I couldn't see you before.
Hey, yeah, we're here. I'm glad you can see us, and thank you so much for having us as part of this amazing conference, especially alongside so many people whose work we really admire as well. So we're really excited to present our work to you as well.
Yeah, welcome to TIFA Working Studios and CYBERIA Virtual 2021.
Great.
Are you all set? Can we get, sorry about the little bit of delay.
No worries. We were enjoying the talk, so it was no problem.
Okay.
So we'll just share our screen now. Just a couple of seconds. Great. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great. Cool. So yeah, as was mentioned and very kindly introduced, I'm Sandra, this is Luke, and together we run the design studio You+Pea, and we're based in London.
Yeah, so we have a studio. I guess we kind of term it broadly working between video games and architecture. So this is a few examples of the type of project that we do, which on the one hand includes things like our speculative urban design projects based around the kind of logic of Japanese arcade games. And we've done things like writing kind of articles and histories about how some of these games have come to be and their design. We've also had commissions from bodies like the Royal Institute of British Architects. So we've done a couple of projects for them. One that you can see in the sort of top middle and bottom left, which was looking at the history of picturesque architectural design in the UK through a series of two-player video games, which were integrated with kind of built folly structures within their architecture gallery. And then we've also had other recent kind of commissions, I guess, again, that kind of work between games and architecture. So there's one on the top right, which was a game for a museum in Germany, which was looking at luxury residential skyscrapers in London through a kind of design-based game. And in the middle bottom, an analog game that we made for the UK festival, Now Play This, which was again about the kind of morphology of cities. And then another project we did for the V&A, where we kind of took fragments from game worlds and put them in the gallery because we were interested in blurring the lines between digital artifacts and the artifacts that were found in the V&A's gallery spaces.
Yeah, and an extension of our practice as You+Pea is, as was mentioned, Videogame Urbanism, which is the name of our kind of research cluster based at the Bartlett School of Architecture. So we work with students to make games as kind of urban critique. So here you can see a typical end-of-year exhibition where every student or group of students makes a video game as their primary output, which is kind of displayed and played by the public at the end of the year. And we also produce drawings and things like code books to reveal the kind of principles and structures behind the games themselves as well.
So hopefully this video runs okay, but this is, I guess, a slightly more in-depth kind of assessment of all of the types of work that we've produced in the studio. So I think over the 5 years we've been running, the students have probably made about 60 different games. So this varies from very simple games to a game like this, which was a networked multiplayer game where It was kind of going from studies into the kind of semiotics of architecture and the relationship between sign and signifier by giving players a kind of multiplayer world where they could basically change the meaning and behavior of any object within that world.
And this was a kind of recent shift to the work in response to the pandemic as well. So when students became kind of split up from themselves, they could come together in this virtual space and continue their work, but also their explorations into the game.
And then we had students looking at what might be the new form of art gallery in a kind of remote world. So again, this was a multiplayer game which used procedural generation to create, use an algorithm to generate these different types of archetypal art gallery, where players could create their own folksonomy by using hashtags to kind of sort different artworks that they were interested in. And so we've had other games looking at maybe the hidden infrastructure that connects our everyday spaces and being able to expose that, and even a game that was kind of developed in sync with the COVID mitigation that was happening in the UK at the time. So in this way, they were developing a multiplayer game that was looking at how the City of London was actually changing at the time that they were making the game, and how the city was altered by the restrictions that were placed upon it. So a lot of the games that we make also, they take real cities as their kind of inspiration. So the previous game was looking at Manhattan in relation to the New York casino in Las Vegas. And what we're really interested in doing is students to use games as a way of exposing things about cities that we might not have thought about before, and also to take advantage of their interactive systems to enable people to kind of play them and see them in new ways.
Yeah, so students often, as their starting point to creating these environments, we usually base it on a real place. So this is a game about Tokyo and playing through its history, or we take particular building typologies in different cities. So whether it's looking at the shrine or the casino or various other kind of building typologies that relate specifically to that city, really kind of using the game environment to subvert and reinvent its meaning as well. And also considering how it's played, who's playing it, and how the information is being kind of interacted with, whether it's a kind of playable drawing or a kind of planetary scale system that's exploring the logics of Disney World, as you can see here. Yeah, the way that the space is presented is also really integral to its kind of principles and mechanics as well.
Yeah, a lot of things like this project here, which is looking at the relationship between 2D and 3D space. We're also really interested in, I suppose, examining the history of architectural representation in relation to games. So we see games as a kind of continuation of some of those media, but obviously by being an interactive media, it has another set of properties that it brings with it. And for us, games are really appropriate in this way to understand our world, which is obviously our world and our cities, which are increasingly structured by computation. So a game like this was looking at the zoning and kind of building planning rules in Tokyo, and how this allows you to develop certain types of structure within the city. And likewise, some of the students actually took so the area around the Bartlett where we have the studio in London, and looked at the British planning process and how they could make a game as a kind of participatory tool for people to understand how planning works in the UK and prototype different possibilities for sites.
I think by playing through different scenarios, which might be kind of difficult to digest when on paper, you can definitely start to involve lots of different people and make these discussions more accessible to different types of people through the video game.
Yeah, and I guess on some level there's an interest in, for instance, a game like this, which was looking at geometry, but really it was about creating a city from two different viewpoints. So one player could view the city from above, one person could view it from below, and they'd collaborate together. We also look at things like, the history of art and architecture. So this is a student taking Malevich's Architectons and turning it into a giant kind of urban world, or looking at the Japanese art of kintsugi, which is the repairing of broken pottery, as a kind of method for reconstructing a city around a series of fragments. And in this game, there was like a kind of 1,000 different fragments that were all communicating with one another as the players kind of, I guess, attaching them back together again. So I think the games also, we use multiple different viewpoints and ways of seeing. We're interested in kind of challenging some of, I suppose, some of the embodied assumptions that games also carry with them as well. So obviously we could say, broadly speaking, you get the kind of godlike view of a city builder game, or the first person view of a shooter game, which has a really kind of, it makes you the center of the world. So we're also interested in our students kind of critiquing some of the ways in which the world is seen. In this game, players actually directly type to generate urban form through kind of emoji kind of language, and they would actually have a conversation between two players. And then I suppose these are some other examples of games that we've used which are directly kind of tackling the ecological crisis. So looking at how we live in the everyday, being able to make like a role-playing game where every decision you take influences your carbon footprint, and therefore gives you a kind of better understanding of the impact that your decisions as a citizen make on the world around you.
Well, this was about looking at different forms of connection between underground spaces in London. And then I suppose here finally just kind of, again, revealing the different structures and things but all the systems that go into the world, all the data, and trying to reveal that stuff that goes into the world that's not, I guess, immediately visible to the player when they're actually experiencing it.
Yeah, and also putting the work that we do with the students back into, you could say, slightly more conventional, like architectural and analysis drawings, and finally the use of screenshots. So, you know, maybe in the games industry, the screenshots used as kind of advertising tool, but we actually use the screenshot, ask students to take many screenshots of their games so that they can start to talk about the kind of the temporal aspect of the game worlds that they're creating through compositing drawings that are composed of, in this case, of like hundreds of small screenshots kind of stitched together into new forms of drawn worlds. So I guess that this kind of ties into some of the other research that we've been doing, and has been taking up quite a lot of our time over the last year, which was I guess that we find this a good place to start, which is if you look at it's actually quite an old game now, but if you look at Grand Theft Auto and the city of Los Santos, especially from an outsider's viewpoint, there's a kind of visual resemblance to Los Angeles, which is really striking. But when you actually break down the game world and kind of look into it more, you find that it diverges from reality in many ways, and many interesting ways. So in the past, we've kind of done critical work exploring this through drawing and mapping. So trying to build up an alternative picture of how this world works and all of the systems that regulate it. And so this has kind of led us on to a project that we've been working on for a while, which is a book coming out next year, which is notionally titled the Video Game Atlas. And in this book, we've done about 200 drawings, essentially as analysing video game worlds in the way that an architect might analyse a kind of real site in order to understand it. Yeah, so we've selected 12 very different commercial video games, and we're really exploring them spatially through the kind of typical means that you would if you were looking at real sites. And this is something that to us is, and I hope to the audience, is going to reveal some really interesting and unique spatial conditions. So through various different forms of mapping, such as this kind of large-scale world map of Zelda, to kind of shrine elevations and movement paths and patterns, or all the different architectural facades that you might get in Animal Crossing, to kind of population density in Assassin's Creed. Yeah, I mean, I think for us it's about using, I guess, the architectural viewpoint to look at these game worlds in a slightly different way. So I think, as Sandra was saying, if you look at something like Assassin's Creed Unity, it's really interesting because there's been quite a lot written about how they translated the sort of monumental buildings of Paris into the game. But what they also did was to build a procedural tool that generates city blocks, so that the designers could like rapidly iterate things, because so much of the game is actually about parkour and about climbing up and down buildings. And so you can see from like the top left drawing is that we're starting to identify a kind of series of objects that get used within the game world over and over again in order to facilitate movement. But then on the bottom right, the bottom left, sorry, there's also the idea of the crowd becoming a kind of key part of the space of Assassin's Creed Unity, pretty much all Assassin's Creed games, where you can hide in the crowd. But it's also really interesting because the game is set around the time of the French Revolution, and actually the French Revolution and the kind of congregation of crowds is something that was written about a lot in kind of theory that emerged maybe like 50 to 100 years later about the agency of crowds. So actually the developers have picked a really kind of interesting point in time to understand urban space that actually has a much larger kind of field that kind of emerges from it.
Yeah, we're looking at the kind of, I don't know if many people have played the game Katamari Damacy, where you play as this giant ball, slowly growing, rapidly growing, and picking up lots of objects in a city. So the chaos that might exist in a kind of 2 to 3 minute gameplay, if you slow that down and kind of draw all the objects and spaces that you interact with, it reveals a really kind of interesting method of inhabitation in this one kind of, this just one level, which we find really interesting to transcribe into a drawing. Yeah,
or by looking at the kind of collision maps and skeletons of Grand Theft Auto on the right, we can see that there's kind of interesting moves that the developers make where like trees are kind of immutable objects and buildings are immutable objects. You can't generally, there's not really many buildings you could like smash into the window of, but other objects are treated in a much kind of more freeform way in relation to the physics systems. So for us, again, it's really interesting because with architecture, we take materials to have some kind of truthfulness, but in the world of a video game, let's say the world of the material and the world of the visual are actually kind of quite separated. And so we've done a lot of drawings that do things like actually separate them and make it clear what the difference between those is. And then I think we've gone into detail. So if you don't know the game Dwarf Fortress, we'd recommend you have a look at it. It's this game that's purely kind of generated through ASCII and represented through ASCII symbols. But what's really fascinating is this is probably one of the most complex simulations of a society and a world that you can find both within and outside of games. And so for us, it was really fascinating to look at this in terms of the fact that this game generates this kind of incredibly complex world with many different histories. And as a result, generates a whole kind of community of people who, to be honest, are acting like architects and who are designing buildings around this world. But also it connects into like the history of architectural drawing and this kind of encoded visual world. And then I suppose just the final one to say is we're looking at something like the city of Midgar, which is in the Final Fantasy VII game, and how this city is being kind of rebuilt because the game was remade 24 years after the original game. So what does it mean to take a virtual city with its own history and remake that? And so we're really interested in the kind of divergent qualities of the two versions of this one city that people would come to know. So I guess...
Yeah, this is maybe just to kind of finish on another project which we've kind of has been ongoing for a little while, but we've represented and been testing through different mediums. So this is a kind of concept drawing for a project called Everyone is Architecture. So it's a kind of AR game where people embody different fragments of architecture, a kind of collaborative building tool for different underutilized sites where people can kind of come together and assemble themselves into different structures and arrangements.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I guess the name Everyone is Architecture is inspired by Hans Helene's declaration that everything is architecture, which, at the time was talking about the kind of expanding field of the discipline and how many other things could be incorporated into and sort of understood as architecture. And so for us, this is also a kind of key aspect of what we believe about or what we find in video games, that they have many traces to architecture, but they also represent potentially an expansion of the field of architecture as well. So this is one of the kind of first concept videos we made for the game, of it as this kind of AR environment where players can essentially, Sandra says, players can embody a kind of piece of a building. But again, rather than using it as a design tool where you kind of have a differential scale between someone operating the software and someone then placing objects in the world, we were really interested by the idea that an AR game could like directly map one-to-one into the world. So by people standing in certain configurations in reality, which might be quite bizarre, like 6 people or 8 people standing in a kind of weird configuration in reality. Yeah, through the physics engine of the game, they'd actually be creating a building that kind of stands up in the virtual world. So there would be this kind of requirement for a sort of playful collaboration within the game world in order to produce something that would work in the logic of the game world. Whereas when you go back to the real world, you're actually looking at people kind of standing around in this sort of weird kind of positioning. So for us, we think there's something really interesting there about the kind of social engagement that could be created, potentially also different types of building systems, which I suppose also challenge this kind of remote view that one typically has when they're using design software, where we're kind of looking into the thing as an artifact as well.
I think we also really enjoy using the kind of prototype ideas and speculations rather than us try to create very open environments. So really kind of early concept stage projects too.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting things about game engines for us as well is that every game engine carries within itself like a different way of viewing and kind of understanding the world, different logics, you know, different types of simulation of light and things like that. So we had the opportunity as part of a Dezeen and Epic Games an Architects Journal feature, those Architects Journal and Epic Games, to do a kind of reimagining of this project, which was originally kind of looked at with the Unity game engine, to do a version of it using Twinmotion, which is an Unreal Engine based visualization software. And it was really interesting for us here to be able to conceptualize the project in a different way, to take advantage of Unreal's kind of more realistic, out of the box kind of way of rendering the world. And so it was, for us, it was really nice because it gave us the opportunity to, I suppose, further blur the lines between what the actual physical things were that were built and what the virtual things were, and understand a bit more about what some of the spatial implications might be of this game system that we're proposing.
Yeah, I think playing with, I guess, this level of materiality, vegetation, kind of interface with the urban, with nature, versus the kind of very flat, colourful, kind of non-committal world of the previous prototype, it kind of starts to reveal new qualities about its potential as a tool, as an urban game.
Yeah, and so this was a kind of the second version of the project in a way, which was, again, starting to imagine how materiality might start to become an important part of the virtual world, and in a sense how we might start to create a structure where, let's say, the colourful game worlds that we create, they always have a sort of air of impossibility to them because the colours are unreal. But as we start to get into this slightly more, I guess, blurred boundary between real and virtual materials, and obviously with an engine like Unreal, there's this whole kind of ecosystem of real world objects and things that have been scanned. We think it's really fascinating because although we've really prized the kind of game-like aesthetic in our work over a number of years, we're also becoming increasingly interested in these kind of blurred boundaries, and when something might start to look so realistic that it's kind of probably improbable, but you don't really know if it is improbable or not. And I guess this is also the whole idea of video game urbanism and all of the kind of theory that we've developed over the last few years. Again, we're regularly kind of writing about some of these things. This was a piece we did a couple of years ago for Volume magazine, which was a sort of visual manifesto of video game urbanism. So I guess generally it's a kind of call that for us, you know, we grew up playing games. All of the students that we have nowadays, they play games and are kind of passionate about them. And the line between the virtual and the real economy, society, culture is really not necessarily something that is even a distinction anymore. And so for us, that means that we can see this practice as something that's emerging, but something that's kind of already here. And I think we feel like the future design of our urban spaces is going to need to kind of engage, you know, continue to engage with this software. One of the real reasons being for that is that games are like, they allow us to make sense of computational systems. And I think when you think of the future and things to do with like AI and smart cities and stuff like that, there's the potential for the world to become so kind of complicated that we can't understand it, and only the computers can, and the people that control all the computers. So for us, I think games give that kind of window through to understanding, which is extremely powerful.
Thank you. I think that's it. Thanks.
That was great. I really liked the last project. Okay, I'm just gonna quickly go through the questions that we have. The first question is, can you elaborate a little more on how you tackle the concept of a player or a virtual human being in the design of these game spaces?
Yeah, so I usually we ask the student to, or in our own work as well, but we kind of start with sort of site analysis to understand, because a lot of the work that we do does, especially with students, comes from the perspective of looking at a city in order to analyze it and understand it. So I suppose what, like a really clear example was the carbon footprint game that we showed, where they took the player in a kind of conventional sense as a third person player, but in the game it asks you a series of questions which I think were taken from the World Wildlife Foundation, which are designed to give you a sense of your own carbon footprint. So they build up a kind of alternative, I guess, avatar for the player, which is composed of all of their kind of energy usage.
And it's, in that sense, it's different every time because you're kind of customizing it to your own footprint or your own preferences often. So you don't always go in as the same player as well. The world is kind of morphed around your input too.
Yeah, and or for instance, in the London Developer Toolkit game, which was the one that we showed right at the start with the kind of funny drawing and the screen, in that game you're playing as an architect, but essentially you don't have any agency. The developers give you these tasks to do, and you don't really have. The game generates a kind of building at random, and so there we were kind of using the concept of the player and the agency they have by removing agency to, I guess, make a kind of comment on how the market and the kind of capitalist structure generates a certain type of architecture, which we're seeing a lot of in London now, and that the architect has, some authorial role within that, but also it's limited by the kind of the models that the developers are using as well. So we wanted the player to have the sense that they were doing something, but also the sense that what they were doing didn't necessarily matter. The game was going to generate something for them, whatever they did.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting because a lot of other games have like the game spaces unfolding based on the character behavior. And this is like a opposite kind of an approach where you could still explore irrespective of what you do. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Okay, the next question is by Anuj. He says, amazing games. How big is your team and how long does it take to make one of your games?
You're looking at our team predominantly. We, as mentioned by Jimenez and probably lots of other people, we do collaborate with a lot of different types of people, whether that's people from the games industry, developers, or curators, different cultural institutions. So I think it can change like depending on the project and the time scale. Yeah, I think it depends, but we definitely really enjoy the kind of cross collaboration between lots of different perspectives and industries, and that's something we're trying to position ourselves between lots of different facets of, I suppose, games, architecture, spatial design, participatory design as well. So
yeah, our student projects are usually, the main projects are usually done in teams, but typically what we do is we throw them in at the deep end and ask them all to make a game in the first semester of the year individually.
Yeah.
So then we can see what they also, what way of seeing the world they gravitate towards. Is someone more interested in making a game with a God view above because they're really interested in systems, or are they interested in experiences, so they make a first person game, and then that gives us kind of sense. But most of the games we showed in the video would be like 2 or 3 people working together, and they usually get about like 6 months to work on the kind of main project that they do.
Yeah, we actually find the longer that the games are worked on, actually sometimes the shorter space allocations, time allocation often are more successful because you have that kind of burst of energy and you communicate it very quickly rather than keep adding and adding and adding, which, as we know, in something like a virtual environment can massively kind of cause things to lag and slow down.
But we're not selling any of our games, so we don't have to make everything very polished and you know, give with the level of expectation if you were selling it, so they can make kind of weird things, and if it doesn't work completely but it's really cool, then that's still productive.
Yeah,
it's like sketching with video games.
Yeah, it's
Like
very
your
messy.
ideas. Yeah,
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I think, okay, last question that I have. What video games are you currently playing that you really enjoy, and what books are you reading right now?
We really play anything and everything, like from teaming up in various battle royale games to kind of more abstract art games, indie games. We just got the new WarioWare Nintendo game in the post, so we'll probably be playing that tonight. Obviously, as part of our book, we played and played and played a lot of these 12 commercial games, which included, like, you know, Zelda, Fortnite. I've been working on it for a year and I've completely slipped my mind now.
Persona
5, Grand Theft Auto 5. Yeah, lots of different types. I think we're not too prejudiced, but we do play a lot for research, obviously.
Yeah, I just finished the new intermission DLC for Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I think is, growing up playing that game and how amazing the city was then, to be able to revisit it now is like, it's incredibly nostalgic, because you do have those kind of associations to the place. So I think, and I guess the other one is just got Demon Souls again, which again is like a game that's like, I don't know how many years old now, is it like 15 or something, but that's been remade. And for us, there's something really cool about the fact that there's this cycle now of like old games being remade, which is this sense of preservation in a way, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. And what are you guys reading?
I'm trying not to read anything at the moment because I'm about to start a PhD, which will involve a lot of reading. So I'm slowly accumulating books, but putting them off, largely relating to the kind of world building theory, theme park design. Yeah, lots of broad things.
Yeah, I think we've been looking at some interesting books about like a kind of ethnographic history of Tokyo, and a book that we've been meaning to read for a while. I can't remember who the author is now, but it's called Beautiful Fighting Girl, which is like the role of kind of strong, like, female, really powerful characters in anime and where they come from. We don't know exactly what the conclusions are about that yet, but we've been meaning to read this for ages. So now we've finished our own book, we've got the chance to dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I think we can stop here. Thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
I want to thank